In the years prior to the creation of Canada in 1867, the Fathers of Confederation were not too concerned about the land that would one day become Alberta. John A. Macdonald, the man who would become Canada's first Prime Minister, even wrote, "I'm quite willing, personally, to leave the whole country a wilderness for the next 50 years. Macdonald quickly changed his tune when he was given 7.2 million reasons to do so. This is Alberta, the stories that made us. Canada acquires Rupert's Land. Before we learn about the 7.2 million reasons, we need to take a step back and look at the country that was created in 1867. Canada was formed with 4 provinces: New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Ontario, and Quebec. Where Alberta sits today was part of a massive area that was known as Rupert's Land. Rupert's Land was created by the British government in 1670, and the Hudson's Bay Company, yup, the same company as the stores, was given control over trade in the territory. Almost no consideration was given to the many Indigenous peoples that had lived there and called the land home for centuries. But we'll get back to that. For the next 200 years, traders for the Hudson's Bay built forts and trading routes through much of the territory. The Indigenous groups in the area traded with the Europeans in what became known as the fur trade. Now, rather than hunting or trapping to feed and clothe their people, these Indigenous people did so to trade for things like metal goods, sugar, guns, and even alcohol. By the time John A. and his 7.2 million reasons came along in the 1860s, a fashion trend was impacting the Hudson Bay Company's business. Silk was the new in thing in Europe, and fur was out. This made Rupert's Land less important from a trading perspective, but the region still had value, especially after the Americans paid $7.2 million to buy Alaska from Russia. Worried that the Americans might do the same with Rupert's Land, John A. sent 2 ministers, Cartier and McDougall, to London to make a deal. If Alaska was worth $7.2 million, the Hudson's Bay Company figured they would get $40 million for Rupert's Land. The British government, though, weren't really big fans of the Americans at the time, and so they stepped in, basically forcing the Hudson's Bay Company to sell Rupert's Land to Canada for $1.5 million. But the question remains, how could the Hudson's Bay sell land it didn't technically own? And how are the Indigenous people who lived on the land going to feel about having their lands sold to Canada? The sale was a major event in the history of Canada, and also one that would eventually result in the formation of Alberta, but that would happen a little bit later. For now, the land that would become Alberta was a part of the Northwest Territories. With the fur trade essentially over, the First Nations groups who depended upon it were significantly impacted. British Columbia would join Canada next, stretching the country from the Atlantic to the Pacific. A railroad would be built to connect the entire country and bring farmers and ranchers to settle the West. These settlers, however, arrived in a dangerous place, full of shady characters such as whiskey traders. And the land that they were to farm were the grazing areas of thousands of buffalo. Not to mention, the settlements were being built on the lands where the First Nations people lived. Many challenges lay ahead.